Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome back. Shabbat Shalom. I hope that you had a wonderful morning after services today. And I want to thank you, even though I don't know who's out there, for joining me again this afternoon for Shabbat Chaverim. My intention was to delve a little bit more into our Torah portion for this Shabbat, which is Mishpatim. Mishpatim means laws. And this is the first time in the Torah when, after having received the Ten Commandments from God at Mount Sinai, Moses is now beginning to relay all of the laws that he has gotten thus far and the ones that he is sitting in judgment of when the Israelites come to him with disputes. We know that he's already also selected 70 other judges who are going to help him with this process. And in going through some of the mishpatim, some of the laws that we get in this Torah portion, it is really nothing short of overwhelming, because it is, as I mentioned, it's the first time that the Israelites are getting this huge group of laws and precepts all at the same time. Realize that they've only been out of the land of Egypt for a short period of time. They are unaccustomed to life in the wilderness. They're unaccustomed to life of some choice, because they're no longer getting up every morning as slaves and being told what to do. And so this had to have been particularly overwhelming. I'm, of course, overlaying my own personal feelings into this, but I can just imagine what this must have been like coming out of slavery, being about 6 weeks or 7 weeks into one's journey, and suddenly being hit with so many pieces of information. So I had the same feeling as I was trying to prepare for this program this afternoon. And I decided that rather than trying to do this all in one session, we're going to break it up. So this coming Wednesday morning at 10:30, I'll also be doing a Chai There with Rabbi Leah. And what I'm going to do is, since this is the Torah portion for the week, I'm going to continue to delve into some of these issues that are brought up in this particular Torah portion. All of this, by the way, is a lead in to what's going to happen next week. Because at the end of this week's Torah portion, Moses is called up to Mount Sinai. He's accompanied by Aaron and his 4 sons, and the 70 judges, all of whom stop at a certain point. Moses then continues to the top of the mountain, where he will spend the next 40 days and 40 nights listening to everything that God has to tell him, with the intention that he will now bring it back and teach it to the Israelites. That, of course, is the prelude to what's going to happen down below the mountain during those 40 days and 40 nights, when the people who have just received all of these laws are probably feeling tremendously overwhelmed. Why did we leave Egypt? And are now going to rebel through the sin of the golden calf. So bear that in mind as we are going through some of these laws and precepts that the Israelites are going to get at this time. And as I said, I'm going to start this today, and then I'll continue on Wednesday with our Chai There with Rabbi Leah, so that you get a really good sense of how much is in this particular Torah portion. So I thought what I would do initially is just give you a sense of the range of laws that are being distributed by Moses verbally in this Torah portion, just so that you can see the vast array of subjects that are covered. We begin with talking about the death penalty for striking someone, even if that individual doesn't die when you strike them. And there are very specific individuals whom one could strike even without killing them, for which the death penalty would still be um, uh, given. And in particular, we are told that striking one's mother or father results in the death penalty. By the way, this morning in services, I talked about the servant, the Hebrew servant, the Israelite servant to an Israelite master, and what happens after a period of 6 years if they want to go free. So I'm not going to discuss that again now because we already discussed that this morning in the Torah, the Devar Torah that I did for services, but realize that that has already taken place. We learn in this Torah portion what happens when a pregnant woman is struck because she happens to get in the middle of an argument between two men. And this is a very, very interesting portion of this Torah portion because it is the piece from which Judaism, or at least much of Judaism, derives its belief of the unborn child. So, in a nutshell, if two men are fighting and the wife of one of them, who just so happens to be pregnant, gets in the middle of the argument and she is knocked down and she miscarries, there is, but she's not hurt, there is no penalty to the one who struck her. However, if she gets in the middle of this argument and is struck down and dies, then there is a penalty. So you see that in one scenario, the woman is okay, but the baby she miscarries the fetus. In the other scenario, she is struck down and she dies. And it is in that scenario that the penalty is paid. So without delving into this in a much, much more deep way, on the surface, what we learn from that is that this unborn child that she's carrying, even though she miscarries, there is no penalty for that. The penalty is only if she is struck and dies. So that gives us some insight and some thought as to the way in which the value of the life of the unborn child is taken into consideration. And at least from these particular verses, that unborn child's life has no value, at least no monetary value. Perhaps, of course, emotional value, because no woman wants to get struck, fall down, and lose her baby. But nevertheless, from a legal standpoint, that unborn child derives no monetary value if it is miscarried. Okay. We get into here a whole discussion about what happens if a servant is struck and loses an eye, or a servant is struck and loses a tooth. And there are monetary penalties for that. So if I have a servant and somebody else, there's an accident and somebody else strikes that servant and that servant loses an eye or a tooth, I am given monetary compensation for that individual because they can no longer serve me in my household. It's understandable why someone who loses an eye may not be valuable to me anymore as a servant because they possibly can't see the work that they are supposed to be doing for me. But why a tooth? Well, we can surmise a number of things from that. Possibly If someone loses a tooth, it may mean that they can no longer eat properly. And if somebody can't eat properly, we know that they aren't able to sustain their bodies. And if you can't sustain your body, you don't have the energy to do the work that you're supposed to be doing as a servant. That's only something that I'm surmising. Maybe we'll find something later in some of the research that I've done that will indicate why that is. We also learn about what happens if I have an ox that gores somebody and injures them, what kind of compensatory damages there are. Now, if somebody is walking by my field one day and decides to climb over the rail, the fence, and I have an ox there and the ox gores that person, there is compensatory damage. However, if I have an ox that has a reputation in the neighborhood as an ox that gores people, and that ox gets loose and gores somebody, the damages are even higher. So, this, I think of some of these people who have these dangerous exotic pets. They keep dangerous snakes, or they keep dangerous, uh, uh, they keep lions, or they keep cheetahs, or something like that. We always hear about people who, have a tendency towards some of these more dangerous animals, and they get loose and they do damage and they hurt people or kill people, and what kind of damages. It's just interesting to see that as old as our Torah is, these were issues that were being discussed at that time. Okay, what else? If a thief breaks into your house in the middle of the night and you kill them, or they break into your house even in the middle of the day and you kill them, in the middle of the act of stealing from you, that is not considered murder, because you are protecting your domicile. You're protecting your home, your family, and so on. If somebody steals something from you, and in the case that they're giving in the Torah portion, an animal, whether it be a lamb or an ox or something of that nature, and you find them with that item, the damages are not just to return that item, but in some cases twofold, and in some cases fourfold. So you don't return one lamb, you return 4 lambs. Okay, we get the injunction at least twice in this Torah portion not to oppress the stranger. So the stranger would be, in the case of this particular Torah portion, probably talking about the non-Israelite, that they are not to be oppressed, because, and we the words that we know, that we've heard over and over and over again, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And so that we hear that at least twice in this Torah portion. We learn that we are not supposed to impose interest on a loan to our fellow Israelite, that when you loan money to them, you are not permitted to charge them interest, and you're not permitted to humiliate them or embarrass them in trying to get that loan paid back. And we're going to read an interesting midrash today about that, and or either today or on Wednesday. I don't know when we'll get to it, but we will get to it. Okay. When a person comes to you for a judgment, and you are either one of these judges that Moses has assigned, or you come before Moses yourself, you are not to glorify the poor or the rich in a lawsuit. And if we put on our modern day rabbinic hats and try to parse this out, we realize that often we will watch a widely televised trial, and we may find that our hearts are turning in sympathy or empathy to the plaintiff or the defendant based on who they are. based on, their upbringing, based on the color of their skin, based on their name, based on how much money they have. And the law in the Torah we read is that you are not supposed to lift up either the wealthy or the poor in judgment, and nor are you to take a negative attitude towards them just because they happen to be rich or poor. So these are laws that God is passing on to Moses, which Moses will, of course, pass on to these judges who are working so feverishly to listen to the disputes of the people. If you are walking down the road and you're a donkey driver and you see your enemy and or you see your enemy's donkey and that donkey is overburdened and basically can't stand up because of the burden that it's carrying, you are commanded to help your enemy's donkey. So that's the example that's used in the Torah portion. But of course, the rabbis are going to come along and extrapolate that to say that even when your enemy is in need, whether it is their animal that's suffering under the burden of a very heavy load, or whether it might be something else, if your enemy's house is burning down, you don't get to sit by and watch that tragedy take place. You have to help. And there's actually a very interesting midrash that talks about the fact that two men were both donkey drivers, and one of them, and they were enemies, and they passed by each other, and one of them saw the other's donkey go down under its burden, and he walked right by it, and then he remembered this commandment in the Torah, and he came back to help, and he struggled with the other donkey driver, and they got this donkey back up on its feet, and they took the load off of it, and they repositioned it, and they became friends. And so it's the lesson is that one in helping out one's enemy, they may no longer be an enemy to you. Okay, what else is in here? We learn about the 7th year of the land lying fallow, also known as the Shemitah. And we're in a Shemitah year right now. So for 6 years, you can till the soil and grow your crops and reap your harvest. In the 7th year, the land has to lie fallow. And this is not only agriculturally sound, because science knows that if you over cultivate a piece of land, that the nutrients are leached out of the soil, and the best way to have that soil regenerate is to allow it to rest for a period of time. So built right into the Torah is this injunction that tells us that in the 7th year we have to let the land lie fallow. You are allowed to harvest crops which have already been planted. You are allowed to pick fruit that has already come to the tree, but you cannot plant new crops. So I happen to live in Israel during the Shemitah year. It's very interesting because there are some things you can get, there are some things you can't get. There are some things that you purchase from neighboring Arab farmers because those are not considered in the land of Israel, and so or not grown by Jewish hands, and therefore are fair game, so to speak. And so we learn briefly about the Shemitah year. We'll learn more about it later. What's very interesting about a lot of these mishpatim, a lot of these laws, is that they're going to be elaborated upon in later parts of the Torah, and some in the book of Leviticus and some other places, but we are going to hear them come up again. Okay. We are told about the festivals of ingathering, meaning the 3 festivals during which everybody from the land of Israel is supposed to go to Jerusalem to do their sacrifices at the temple there. Of course, there was no temple built yet when this part of the Torah takes place, and yet we're preparing for the future. And what are those 3 pilgrimage festivals? Well, they are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. And I'm giving those to you in the order in which they fall in the Hebrew calendar. So Pesach, which comes in the month of Nisan, Nisan is the first month of the Hebrew calendar. So the first festival, which happens in the middle of the month, Passover, is the first of the pilgrimage festivals, and that, of course, is the spring harvest, the harvest of barley, where we gather the omer, the barley, the sheaves of barley. And then the next one is Shavuot, which comes a few months later, and that's the one where it comes actually exactly 7 weeks later after Passover, and that is the festival of Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, and it's another harvest festival in the summer months. And then, of course, in the fall is Sukkot, where we have the fall harvest festival following the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we build booths. So that is also laid out in this Torah portion. Perhaps the most critical, or I don't want to say critical, but most impactful commandment that we get in this week's Torah portion comes in chapter 22, verse 19. And this, maybe more than a lot of others, has had an enormous impact on Judaism, both ancient and modern, because it is the first time we hear the injunction about not cooking a kid, meaning a baby goat, in the milk of its mother. So the Exodus 22:19 is the verse. We're going to hear it twice in this Torah portion, and then we're going to hear it again in Leviticus later on. But nevertheless, this is the verse from which sprang the entire system of kashrut. This, along with, the injunction about certain foods that may and may not be eaten, which we will hear more about in the book of Leviticus. Not eating any animal that doesn't have a cloven hoof and chew its cud, not being permitted to eat crustaceans, those creatures which live in the sea that have shells, not being able to eat chazer, pig, which is very specifically mentioned in the Torah. And so because there seemed to be some confusion about that, there is no confusion about that. So we know that there are different kinds of laws surrounding kashrut, what we may and may not eat. The first part of those laws is very specifically what you may eat and what you may not eat. And then the second part of those laws speaks directly to food preparation. And that's what we have here in Exodus 22:19. Lo tivashel gedi b'chalav imo. You may not cook a kid in the milk of its mother. And it is from that verse that the rabbis created this very elaborate system of kashrut, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And we know that some of the injunctions are directly from the Torah, and some of them came much later and were the rules of the rabbis that we read in the Talmud. So lots of controversy, especially for those of us who are progressive Jews living in 21st century USA. Okay, finally, towards the end of the Torah portion, we read that if you worship God and follow the commandments, you're going to have food and drink and no illness. So the rewards for following God's laws are, an unencumbered life where you will eat and you will drink and you won't be ill. And yet we know, because we live in the real world, that this doesn't always happen, that there are plenty of times that there are people who are wonderful people, who are righteous human beings, who may even be exceedingly religious and practice all ritual, and yet get sick and die or starve or any one of a number of horrible things may befall them. So that is a discussion for another time. I'm just telling you that's what's in this Torah portion. And then finally, at the very end, we get the description of Moses and the judges and Aaron and his 4 sons going up partway to Mount Sinai. And then Aaron and his sons and the judges remaining midway up, Moses continuing the journey to the top, where he will remain for the next 40 days and 40 nights, getting the rest of what he needs to disseminate to the Israelites. Okay, so now you kind of have an understanding of how much, and by the way, what I gave you was the abridged version of what's in this Torah portion. We do hear towards the end of the parsha, in the 7th verse of chapter 24, that Moses took the book of the covenant. So he apparently has received the 10 commandments and the book of the covenant at this point, and he read it within the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that the Lord spoke, we will do and we will hear." Now, it's important to understand the order in which this verse is spoken. So the people are listening to Moses. He's reading the book. They can all hear what he's reading. And they say to him, "All that God has said, we will do and we will hear." An unusual order, right? Usually you hear something and then you say, "I'll do it." In this case, they've said, "We'll do it and then we'll listen to it." So one wonders why that order. Now, most of what you'll read by the rabbis will say that it is something that we applaud the Israelites for, because their faith in God was such that even though they may not have clearly understood or heard all the details, they are willing to take this on and commit to it. Whereas one of the Midrashim tells us that when God wrote the Torah, that he kind of shopped it around to the different cultures that were in existence, and they all wanted to know what was in it first before they would commit to doing what was in it. The Israelites, on the other hand, said, "You know what, we'll do it and then we'll listen." So that comes at the end towards the end of this Torah portion as well. So now what we're going to do is we're going to get into some of the very specifics on some of these laws, which I've enumerated. And what I don't get done with you today in Shabbat Chaverim, we will pick up on Wednesday in Chai There with Rabbi Leah. So just for your edification today, in order to really look into some of these various mishpatim, these laws and precepts and ordinances, I'm going to be using my my trusty Sefer HaAgadah, which there you can see it, the Book of Legends, which were the ways in which the rabbis saw some of these precepts and were able to explain them. And I'm going to start with the beginning of the Torah portion and work my way through. So this particular parasha, Mishpatim, is Exodus chapters 21 through 24. And so I'm going to start, and you'll have to forgive me as I flip pages here. And the print is teeny, teeny, tiny, so I may have to remove my glasses to see it, but that's okay. You're seeing more of my face now than you've probably seen in 2 years, because most of the time it's covered up to here. Okay, 627. So, this is an interesting so the very, very first verse of the Torah portion says, "These are the ordinances which thou shalt set before them." And this is God speaking to Moses and saying, these are all the rules that I'm going to start giving you that you need to disseminate to the Israelites. So it's very interesting because we get a conversation among the sages, and they're saying what's meant by the word them. These are the ordinances which thou shalt set before them. So who is the them in this verse? And of course, the rabbis, the ancient rabbis, love to have these conversations about one word or one letter in a word. And the sages of the school of Rabbi Eliezer said that this verse comes to teach us that Scripture is saying a woman is equal to a man in regard to all of the ordinances governing relations between one person and another. So, some of these things which I laid out that are covered in this Torah portion have to do with a person's relationship to God, or a person's relationship to the treatment of animals, and so on and so forth. But with respect to a person's treatment of another person, the them or the they, these are the ordinances which they shall have incumbent upon them. Rabbi Eliezer's disciples said that this refers to women as well. So, okay, women are responsible for treating other people the same way that the commandment would apply to men. What happens, though, if a woman sins? Is she now subject to the same punishments that a man would be subject to? And the sages of the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught in the verse, when a man or woman commit any sin, and that is actually a reference to something that's going to come in the book of Numbers, but they bring it back to this Torah portion. And they say that Scripture makes a woman equal to a man in regard to all penalties prescribed in the Torah. So not only is a woman obligated for those mishpatim, those precepts, laws, commandments related to the treatment of how one person treats another person, but they are also subject to any penalties that come by falling into sin. I find this very, very interesting because to me, it feels as if women are obligated for all the same mishpatim, all the same commandments. They are culpable if they foul up and mess up and can have the same punishments, but they're really not allowed all of the benefits. So we know that in traditional Judaism, in Orthodox Judaism, women are not obligated to certain mitzvot. So, mitzvot such as praying 3 times a day, mitzvot such as wearing tefillin, or wearing fringes, and so on and so forth. Now, you might say, well, great, women don't have to do all the stuff that men have to do. But women are not obligated to do those mitzvot which are considered time bound, meaning they have to be done at a certain time of day, because the presumption is that women are too busy taking care of the home and the children to have to drop everything and go pray 3 times a day, or wrap tefillin, or do anything else that has to be done at a specific time of day. And yet they are subject to all the punishments. And by the way, women are often subject to punishments that men are not subject to, such as the whole notion of a woman who uh, is not necessarily committing adultery, but is suspected of committing adultery. She is the sotah, and she is subject to all kinds of punishments that men are not subject to. So it seems like a little bit of an imbalance here. Women are subject to all of these precepts that have to do with how we treat another human being. They can be punished. They are equal to men in regard to all the penalties that we read about in the Torah, and yet they don't have the benefit of many of the mitzvot that men are permitted to perform. So, um, just chatting a little bit about um, relationships between husband and wife and the genders. Okay, we're going to move on now. And any of these that are of interest to you, I'm happy to go into greater detail. Okay, now we read a midrash that says the following. We talked this morning in our service about what a maidservant or a manservant does if they determine that after their 6-year obligatory time period, they decide that they want to go free. And it's this kind of elaborate process, ritual, where they tell their master. Now, by the way, these are Hebrew slaves. This is a kind of indentured servitude where someone, for whatever reason, may not be able to take care of themselves. So they indenture themselves to a Hebrew master. They become a servant for a period of 6 years. If after that time they want to leave, they may leave. However, if they were married prior to becoming a servant, they can now leave with their wife or their spouse. If, on the other hand, they were not married, which was probably very frequently the case, because it might have been a very young male, for example, or a young female who became an indentured servant, and they might not have yet been married. If they come into that servant-master relationship unmarried, and the master attains or retains for them a spouse, they can leave after 6 years, but they cannot take their spouse with them, and they cannot take their children with them. Those are considered the property of the master of the house. Okay, so we get to the verse in Exodus chapter 21, verse 6, which is in this Torah portion, and it says the following: "And his master shall bore his ear through with an awl," AWL. So I'm a servant. I'm a male servant. I decide after 6 years that I want to go off on my own. Fine, my master sets me free. But if I decide that I want to continue in that relationship, my master will take me to the lintel, to the mezuzah, the door frame of the house. They will take my earlobe, and they will take an awl, which is a pointy, in those days, maybe wood, not metal until many years later, um, pointed tool, hammer it through my ear, attach me to that doorpost, symbolically saying, I am now part of that household, never to be released. Of course, I don't stay in that position. It's symbolic. And then I am released with a hole in my earlobe. It must have been a relatively painful process because, um, there's no anesthesia. They didn't use any Novocaine. So, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai used to expound on this verse in a symbolic way. Why was the ear singled out from other parts of the body? Okay, why didn't they do a blood oath and cut a finger? Why didn't they make a mark on the face? Why didn't they do a lot of different things? So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, because the Holy One said, the ear heard my voice on Mount Sinai when I proclaimed, for unto me the children of Israel are servants. They are my servants and not the servants of servants. Okay, so that is a verse from Leviticus, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai is showing off his biblical acumen by taking two verses from two different places in the Torah and linking them together. And he is trying to explain why the ear and why not some other body part that is used symbolically for this servant to show that they are now part of the master's household. And he goes on to say, yet this man has gone and acquired a master for himself. Let his ear be bored through. So the listening on Mount Sinai, when God proclaims that these children are now my servants, I am the master, they are my servants. Symbolically, it is showing that this manservant is now going to be listening exclusively to his master, that he is now a servant in perpetually for the rest of his life. His master shall bring him unto the door or unto the doorpost. That's the verse that we just read. Rabbi Shimon Barabi expounded this verse in a very symbolic way. Why are the door and the doorpost singled out? So first we want to know why the earlobe is singled out. Now we want to know why the door and the doorpost is singled out from all other parts of the house. Why didn't they take him into the living room? Why didn't they nail his foot to the floor? I mean, there could have been all different things. So Rabbi Shimon Barabi is saying, well, why the doorpost? Because the Holy One said, the door and the doorpost were witnesses in Egypt when I passed over the lintel, which is the horizontal piece, and the two doorposts, the mezuzot, those are the mezuzot, and proclaimed, for unto me the children of Israel are servants, they are my servants, and not the servants of servants. So God proclaimed that in Leviticus that the Israelites are now my servants. No longer are they the servants of the Egyptians. And the Egyptians themselves were servants. They were servants to Pharaoh. So when we get this line, the servants of servants, what we're referring to here is that no longer are these Israelites in servitude to the Egyptians, who themselves are in servitude to Pharaoh. They are now my servants. They will listen to my Torah, they will listen to my commandments, and they will do as I say. And then God, after proclaiming that, brought them forth from bondage to freedom. This servant, who is now proclaiming that he wants to be in perpetuity the servant to this particular master, has said, I have acquired a master for myself for the rest of my life. That is why the ear is bored through in the presence of the door and the doorpost. Because that door and the doorpost was symbolically the way in which the Israelites said, we are putting the blood on the lintel and the mezuzot of this door. That is our proclamation that we believe now in Yahweh, in Adonai as our God, that our faith and our trust will be in God, that we are no longer going to be servants to Pharaoh or to the servants of Pharaoh. And we are showing that through putting the blood on the lintel of the ram, so that when the mashchit, the destroyer, comes through, they will pass over our houses, and we are now indebted to and servants of God. And so this whole process of the ear, the listening, the lintel is reminiscent of what the Israelites have just gone through 7 weeks before when they left Egypt. And so we are getting this trope, this meme playing out in another way. I think it's quite interesting. You may agree with, you know, Rabbi Shimon Barabi about why the lintel. That makes sense to me. You may agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who seemed to have some kind of a fixation on this earlobe thing. But interesting nonetheless to see how it is that our rabbis expound upon this verse. Okay, I think we have time for one more, and I'm going to turn to that one. We're going to do that one quickly, and then we are going to continue on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I'm going to get into a little more detail about the verse about not cooking a kid in its mother's milk, because that's quite fascinating how all of kashrut sprang from that. Okay, so here is another interesting little tidbit. We're now looking at Exodus chapter 21, verse 27, which says, it is written. So Rabbi Yudan, another rabbi of the Talmud, said, it is written, if he smite out his bondsman's tooth or his bondswoman's tooth, he shall let him go free for his tooth's sake. Okay, so if a master incidentally, or maybe not so incidentally, strikes their servant, knocking out their tooth, whether it is the bondswoman or the bondsman, so either a male or a female, he has to let them go free. Now, if because of such smitings, which affect not man's entire body, but only one of his parts, the Torah says he shall go free, how much more and more is a man whose entire body is assailed by suffering certain to be set free in the world to come? This deserves a little bit of explanation. The rabbis of the Talmud were fixated on the world to come. What happens after I leave this earthly plane? And the reason that they were is because they were suffering, and they were suffering greatly. The Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud were written in a time when, in exile, when the Jews had been exiled first to Babylonia, and the Mishnah and the Talmud were in response to the destruction of the temple, the first temple in 586 BCE, when they no longer had a physical home in which their sacrifices could be made, where they could worship God and so on. They were living in foreign lands. They were wondering, why are we suffering this way? Why? It must be for some reason. And the reason was that the suffering in this world and behaving righteously in this life was going to lead to a better life in the world to come, in Olam Haba. So a lot of what the rabbis are writing about, particularly when they're looking at this verse, is if a servant gets their tooth knocked out, and for really kind of a minor infraction, like losing a tooth, because yes, it can be painful, it's certainly going to be annoying, but you don't necessarily die because your tooth is knocked out. But if a tooth is knocked out and a servant is allowed to go free because of that, how much more so is somebody who is really suffering and their entire body is being assailed going to be set free in the world to come? And what the rabbis are really referring to here is the pain and suffering that was the physical pain and suffering that was experienced by so many during this exile, where Jews would be killed in all sorts of horrific ways, hangings and burnings and being flayed and all sorts of things. And the rabbis witnessed this, and they said, so many are suffering, so many physical bodies are being assailed. There has got to be some reward for this. There has got to be some freedom for this. And even for a slave whose tooth got knocked out, something relatively simple, they got to go free. Certainly, we who are suffering greatly are going to find freedom. And if it's not freedom today in this earthly plane, it is definitely going to be freedom in the world to come. So once again, our rabbis are really enabling us to kind of get into their minds, to understand their thought process, how they were able to justify their sufferings in their real life day-to-day world by saying, this is not for naught. All of this is going to have some sort of reward at some point in time. So we have gotten through several of the midrashim that I wanted to talk about. We're going to discuss more this coming week on Wednesday. I hope that you will join me. I don't know if this program is going to show again. You're watching it at 1:15 on Saturday when it's meant to be shown, but it may, I'll have to talk to Life Enrichment and see if they're going to show it again. I also just want to give you an update on what's coming this coming week so that you don't miss a thing. So in checking my calendar, and just to let you know, this coming Wednesday, Hi There is actually at 10:45 a.m. It will be about a 45-minute program. So we are almost into February. Wednesday is February 2nd, 10:45 in the morning. Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Friday night, of course, the 4th, Shabbat Blessings. Saturday morning, 10 a.m., Shabbat services. And then next Saturday at 1:15, another episode of Shabbat Chaverim. So I hope you will join me for all of these programs. And keep checking your calendars, keep checking the Google calendars that are out in the various locations. Your Life Enrichment, wonderful Life Enrichment team will keep you apprised of what's coming up. And in the meantime, I want to wish you a beautiful, peaceful Shabbat. I hope you get outside. I hope you enjoy the weather. Shabbat Shalom. Bye bye.